The Duke reined his horse to a halt when he saw her body half buried in the snow, white fabric blending into the frozen ground, as if winter itself had claimed her. The forest was silent except for the slow breath of the horse and the distant creak of frozen branches. He dismounted without haste, his dark coat untouched by the snowstorm that had passed only hours earlier. One look at her face told him she was still alive, though barely. Her lips were blue, lashes crusted with ice, and her hands were clenched as if she had fought the cold until her strength ran out. She wore the gown of a noble bride, silk-torn, lace-stained with blood and mud. The Duke knelt, lifted her carefully, and felt a faint pulse beneath his gloved fingers. This woman was supposed to be his enemy's wife, the final insult in a war that had lasted years. Logic told him to leave her where she lay. Honor demanded mercy. He chose neither fully and instead wrapped her in his cloak, lifting her onto his horse with a steadiness that hid the storm in his chest. By the time they reached his estate, night had swallowed the land. Servants rushed forward in shock as he carried the unconscious woman inside. No one dared ask questions. Rumors traveled fast in the north, and everyone knew the face on the wanted posters, the bride of Lord Harrington, the man who had burned Duke Alaric's villages and slaughtered his men. Fires were lit, physicians summoned, and hot water prepared. Alaric stood back as they worked, watching her chest rise and fall. When her eyes finally fluttered open, fear flashed instantly, sharp and instinctive. She tried to sit up, but pain forced a cry from her lips. Her gaze locked onto his, dark eyes wide with terror. She recognized him. Of course she did. Everyone knew the Black Duke. "Easy," he said, his voice low, controlled. "You're safe here." She laughed weakly, a broken sound. "Safe." Her voice shook. "From you." He did not answer. Words would only complicate what was already dangerous. She turned her face away, tears slipping silently into her hair. Her name, he learned later, was Eliza Harrington. Married for less than a day before her husband ordered her left in the forest as punishment for daring to speak against his cruelty. The irony was bitter. The enemy he hated had discarded her like a broken thing. Days passed, and Eliza remained under his roof. Each morning she expected chains, interrogation, revenge. Instead, she was given warmth, food, and silence. Alaric kept his distance, yet he was always aware of her presence, of the way the house felt different with her in it. At night, memories haunted him. His mother's body in the snow years ago, abandoned after a raid, her eyes open to the sky just like Eliza's had been. He told himself that was the only reason he had saved her. Mercy born of ghosts, nothing more. Eliza began to walk the halls once her strength returned. Servants whispered, eyes full of curiosity and fear. She met Alaric in the library one evening, standing rigid as if prepared for a blow. "Why am I still alive?" she asked. "Why haven't you sent me back to him, or killed me yourself?" Alaric closed the book in his hands. "Because you are not the war," he replied, "and because I do not punish women for the sins of men." Her breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her like that. In Harrington's house, she had been a possession, a tool for alliance, a trophy. Here, she was treated like a human being, and that terrified her more than cruelty ever had. As weeks passed, something dangerous grew between them. Conversations stretched longer. Silences grew comfortable. Eliza learned that Alaric was not the monster her husband had painted him to be. He learned that Eliza was sharper than she appeared, with a mind trained to observe and survive. Yet every glance carried the weight of betrayal. She was still another man's wife. He was still her husband's sworn enemy. The inevitable happened when Lord Harrington discovered she was alive. His messenger arrived with a sealed letter, demands written in cold ink. Eliza was to be returned at once, unharmed, or war would follow. Alaric read the letter without expression, then burned it in the fire. That night, Eliza confronted him, fear and hope warring in her eyes. "He will come for me," she whispered. "He will destroy you." "He was going to do that anyway," Alaric said. "You are merely his excuse." The truth settled between them like falling snow. By saving her, he had already made his choice. When Harrington's army marched at dawn, banners cutting through the white horizon. Alaric stood on the battlements, Eliza beside him. She should have been afraid. Instead, for the first time in her life, she felt something close to freedom. The war that followed was brutal and short. Harrington underestimated the North, its people hardened by cold and loyalty. When the dust settled, his army lay broken, and he himself was dragged before Alaric in chains. Harrington's eyes went to Eliza, filled with rage and disbelief. "You belong to me," he snarled. Eliza stepped forward before Alaric could stop her. "I never did," she said quietly. "You only own my silence, and even that is gone." Alaric pronounced judgment swiftly. Harrington was exiled, stripped of title and land, doomed to wander as he had forced others to do. When he was gone, silence fell heavy. Eliza turned to Alaric, uncertainty written on her face. "What happens to me now?" The Duke looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an enemy's bride, not as a symbol of war, but as a woman who had survived. "That," he said, "is entirely your choice." Snow began to fall again, soft and endless, covering the scars of battle. Eliza breathed deeply, feeling something warm bloom in her chest despite the cold. For the first time, the future was unwritten, and somewhere between mercy and defiance, between a duke and a woman left to die, a promise had been born that neither of them yet dared to name. The Duke found her just before dusk, when the sky had turned the color of bruised steel and the forest lay frozen in a silence so deep it felt sacred. She was lying in the snow as if placed there deliberately, her white bridal gown spread around her like a burial shroud, already stiff with ice. For a moment he thought she was dead, another nameless casualty of winter and war. But then his horse snorted and she stirred, a faint movement that caught his eye. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the frozen ground, every instinct screaming that this was a trap, yet something stronger pulled him closer. When he knelt beside her, he saw her face clearly, pale and bloodless, lashes dark against her cheeks, lips cracked and blue from the cold. She was young, far too young to be abandoned like this, and the gold ring on her finger told him everything he needed to know. A bride, and not just any bride. He recognized the sigil embroidered on the torn edge of her gown. She belonged to Harrington, his enemy, the man who had sworn to destroy him and had tried more than once. The Duke's jaw tightened as memories surged forward, villages burned, men screaming, blood-staining snow that looked far too much like this. Logic told him to leave her. Justice whispered that this was fate's cruel balance. But when he pressed his fingers to her neck and felt the weakest pulse flutter beneath his touch, something inside him shifted. He removed his cloak and wrapped it around her with careful hands, lifting her weightless body as if she were made of glass. She let out a soft sound, not quite a cry, and her fingers twitched against his chest. The Duke mounted his horse and turned back toward his estate, fully aware that with this single choice, he was inviting chaos into his carefully controlled world. By the time they reached the gates, night had fallen completely. Torches flared as guards rushed forward, shot clear on their faces when they saw what he carried. He said nothing, only ordered that a physician be summoned and fires lit. Servants whispered behind their hands as he laid her on a bed in a guest chamber usually reserved for diplomats, irony sharp and bitter. As they worked to warm her, rubbing life back into frozen limbs, the Duke stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the snow fall outside. He did not look at her, yet he felt every shallow breath she took as if it echoed inside his own chest. When her eyes finally opened, fear came instantly, raw and unfiltered. She tried to sit up, pain twisting her features, and the healer pushed her gently back down. Her gaze found him, dark eyes widening as recognition set in. The stories she had heard were written clearly on her face. "Please," she whispered hoarsely, voice barely there, "don't." The single word cut deeper than any blade. The Duke stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You are safe," he said, and even to his own ears the words sounded strange. She shook her head weakly, tears slipping down her temples into the pillow. "There is no safe with men like you." she murmured, and then exhaustion claimed her again. Hours passed. He did not leave. When the physician finally declared that she would live, though frostbite and fever threatened, the Duke felt a tension ease from his shoulders that he had not realized was there. He learned her name from a servant who had recognized her from the wedding procession days earlier. Eliza Harrington, married that morning, abandoned by nightfall. The reason, whispered through clenched teeth, was that she had spoken out of turn, questioned her husband's orders, embarrassed him before his men. Punishment had been swift and cruel. The Duke closed his eyes at that, seeing too many reflections of the past. He remembered his mother kneeling in snow, begging for mercy that never came, remembered how the world had kept turning as if her suffering meant nothing. That memory had forged him into what he was now. He told himself that saving Eliza was nothing more than defiance against Harrington, a way to deny him even this small victory. Yet when dawn came and pale light filled the room, the Duke found himself watching her sleep, studying the faint color returning to her cheeks, the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. Days followed in a careful routine. Eliza drifted in and out of fever, sometimes murmuring words he could not hear, sometimes waking with a sharp gasp, as if reliving the moment she had been left to die. Each time, the Duke was nearby, though he kept his distance, a silent shadow in the room. When she was finally strong enough to remain awake, she asked the question that had been building behind her eyes since the first moment. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why am I here?" He considered lying. It would have been easier. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than him," he said at last. The truth hung between them, fragile and dangerous. She studied him for a long time, searching for mockery or cruelty, but found neither. Confusion replaced fear, and something like cautious hope flickered briefly before she looked away. As her strength returned, she began to explore the estate under careful watch. The walls that had once felt like a prison slowly became something else, a strange sanctuary. Servants treated her with respect, not obedience born of fear. The Duke remained distant, yet she felt his presence everywhere, in the quiet order of the halls, in the way the guards bowed their heads, not just to rank but to the man himself. At night, when the wind howled outside her window, Eliza wondered what would happen when her husband discovered she was alive. She knew him well enough to understand that mercy was not in his nature. War would come, whether she wished it or not. And when it did, she would stand at the center of it, the spark that ignited old hatred into something unstoppable. Unaware of it, the Duke was thinking the same thing as he stared into the fire one evening, jaw clenched, knowing that by saving one woman from the cold, he had set an entire kingdom on a path from which there was no turning back. Eliza's recovery marked a shift that no one in the estate could quite name, yet everyone felt. She no longer slept through the days, and the haunted look in her eyes softened into something more watchful, more alive. She walked the corridors slowly at first, one hand trailing along the cold stone walls, as if grounding herself in their solidity. Every sound still made her tense. Every raised voice sent a tremor through her, but the Duke's house did not echo with cruelty. It echoed with discipline, order, and a strange, restrained calm. Alaric watched her from a distance, telling himself it was caution, not concern. She was still Harrington's wife, still a liability, still a living declaration of defiance. Yet when she laughed quietly with a maid over a simple mistake, the sound struck him with unexpected force, as if something long dormant inside him had stirred. They spoke more often now, usually by chance rather than design. In the mornings, he would find her in the eastern gallery where sunlight spilled weakly through tall windows, warming the stone just enough to feel alive. She liked to stand there, eyes closed, face turned toward the light, as if memorizing the sensation. One morning, he stopped beside her without realizing he had intended to. "The light is stronger here," he said, the words coming out rougher than he meant. She opened her eyes, startled, then nodded. "It feels like spring," she replied softly. He almost laughed at that. In the north, spring was a rumor, a promise rarely kept. Their conversations remained cautious, circling each other like wary animals. Eliza spoke little of her past unless asked, and even then her words were carefully chosen. She spoke of her childhood estate, of lessons in embroidery and etiquette, of being taught how to smile, how to obey, how to remain silent. She did not speak of love. Alaric did not ask. He spoke of borders, of trade routes, of the cold necessity of rule. He did not speak of the nights he woke choking on smoke that was no longer there, or the faces of men who had trusted him and died anyway. They were two people carrying wounds that did not bleed, learning how close they could stand without touching them. The first threat came quietly. A merchant arrived from the south, bearing spices and silk, his smile too quick, his eyes too sharp. Eliza felt it before anyone spoke. She saw the way he looked at her, recognition flashing and then vanishing behind politeness. That night, a note was slipped beneath her door, the wax seal bearing Harrington's mark. Her hand shook as she broke it open. The words were few and brutal. "You were not forgiven. You were reclaimed." She burned the note in her hearth, watching the wax melt and the paper curl into ash, but the message burned itself into her chest. Sleep did not come. By morning, the Duke knew. He did not ask how. He read it in the tight set of her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned every shadow. "He knows," she said simply when he confronted her in the hall. Alaric nodded. "Then we will act as if he is already here," he replied. Orders were given. Guards doubled, scouts sent north and south. The house shifted from quiet to alert readiness, like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. Eliza watched it all with a growing sense of dread and guilt. None of this would be happening without her. She told him so that night, standing before him with hands clenched at her sides. "You could still send me away," she said. "Hand me over. End this before it begins." Alaric looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If I do that," he said finally, "I teach every man who follows me that fear rules my decisions. I will not rule that way." She swallowed hard. "And what about me?" she asked. "What do I learn?" His voice softened despite himself. "That you are not something to be traded." The words settled into her slowly, changing something fundamental in the way she saw herself. For the first time, she considered the idea that her life was not a burden to be carried by others, but something of value in its own right. That realization was terrifying. Days turned into weeks. Harrington did not come at once. He was a patient man when it suited him, preferring to tighten the noose gradually. Trade slowed. Messengers vanished. Villages along the southern border reported skirmishes, small enough to deny, brutal enough to warn. Each report hardened Alaric's resolve. Eliza watched him in council meetings, saw the way men listened when he spoke, not with blind obedience, but with trust. She began to understand why Harrington feared him. This was not a man driven by rage alone. He was driven by responsibility. One evening, a storm trapped them indoors, wind howling against the windows like something alive. Eliza found Alaric in the armory, inspecting blades by torchlight. The sight of so many weapons made her chest tighten, memories surging unbidden. "Does it ever end?" she asked quietly. He glanced at her, surprised. "War," he said. She nodded. He considered the question seriously. "No," he said at last. "But it changes. Sometimes it becomes quieter. Sometimes it wears different faces." She stepped closer, drawn by something she could not name. "I don't want to be the reason men die," she said. His jaw tightened. "You are not the reason," he replied. "Men choose their reasons." The distance between them closed in that moment, charged and dangerous. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also determination, and something warmer that made him step back abruptly. This path led nowhere safe. "You should rest," he said too abruptly. She nodded, retreating without protest, but the air between them remained altered, heavy with unspoken possibility. The attack came at dawn. Not an army, but assassins slipping through the outer defenses under cover of fog. Steel rang against steel in the courtyard as guards raised the alarm. Eliza woke to shouting and the clash of blades, heart-pounding. She barely had time to grab a cloak before the door burst open and Alaric was there, sword already stained red. "Stay behind me," he ordered, voice sharp with command. She did not argue. They moved through hidden passages he had never shown her before, the estate revealing its secrets as if it, too, had chosen a side. In the chaos, one of the assassins broke through, eyes wild, blade raised. Eliza reacted without thinking, grabbing a fallen torch and swinging hard. The flame caught the man's sleeve, buying just enough time for Alaric to strike him down. Silence followed, broken only by ragged breathing. Alaric stared at her, shock clear on his face. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. She shook her head, hands trembling. "I didn't want to be helpless anymore," she said, almost apologetically. Something fierce and protective flared in his chest. "You weren't," he said. "You never were." When it was over, the cost was counted. Blood stained the snow. Harrington's message was clear. This was only the beginning. Eliza stood on the battlements beside Alaric as the bodies were carried away. The cold bit deep, but she did not shiver. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Alaric agreed. "Neither will I." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and understood that the choice he had made in the forest was not a single act of mercy, but the first step in a war that would decide more than borders. It would decide who they were allowed to become. The aftermath of the attack settled over the estate like a second winter, heavier and more suffocating than the first. Snow covered the bloodstains quickly, hiding evidence but not erasing memory. Eliza could not forget the sound of steel cutting air, the look in the assassin's eyes, empty of mercy or doubt. She had crossed a line that night, from protected guest to participant, and the weight of it pressed on her chest with every breath. Alaric sensed the change in her before she spoke of it. She moved differently now, no longer clinging to walls, no longer startled by every shout. There is a new stillness in her, one born not of fear, but of resolve. Council meetings became more frequent, and though Eliza was not invited, she listened from behind doors, learning the language of war the way she had once learned etiquette. She heard names of villages, numbers of men, supplies measured against time. Harrington's strategy was becoming clearer. A tightening circle meant to starve rather than overwhelm. Alaric countered each move with calm precision, but the strain showed in the lines around his eyes, in the way his hand lingered on the hilt of his sword, even in moments of quiet. One night, Eliza brought him wine, a small gesture, yet one that made him pause. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not unkindly. "Neither should you," she replied softly. He almost smiled. Their closeness deepened in subtle ways. A shared glance during tense moments. A brief brush of hands when passing in narrow halls. Nothing openly spoken, yet everything charged with meaning. Eliza knew what she felt was dangerous. She was still legally Harrington's wife, still bound by a marriage forged in politics and cruelty. Yet that bond felt more like a shadow than a chain now, something that could only hurt her if she allowed it to define her. Alaric, for his part, fought the pull with iron discipline. Desire had no place in war. Attachment was a weakness his enemies would exploit without hesitation. The letter arrived on a gray morning, delivered under a flag of truce. Harrington's seal stared up at Eliza like an unblinking eye. This time, Alaric opened it in her presence. The words dripped with venom masked as courtesy. Harrington proposed a meeting, neutral ground, terms to be discussed. Eliza was the unspoken subject of every line. "He wants to see me," she said quietly. "He wants to remind me who he thinks I belong to." Alaric folded the letter slowly. "He wants leverage," he said, "and he believes you are it." She met his gaze, something unyielding in her eyes. "Then let me be something else." Against every instinct, Alaric agreed to the meeting. It would take place in an abandoned monastery near the border, stone walls crumbling, watched over by ravens and memory. He prepared as if for battle, choosing his men carefully, setting contingencies upon contingencies. Eliza prepared in her own way, dressing not as a bride or a prisoner, but as a noble woman of the North, simple and severe. When Alaric saw her before they departed, something tightened in his chest. She looked like someone who had already survived the worst. The monastery loomed against the sky, a skeleton of faith long forgotten. Harrington arrived with fewer men than expected, his confidence unmistakable, his smile sharp. He dismounted and looked directly at Eliza, eyes raking over her, as if claiming her anew. "You look well," he said. "I see my property has been cared for." The word made Eliza's stomach twist, but she did not look away. Before Alaric could speak, she stepped forward. "I'm not your property," she said clearly. The sound of it echoed against the stone, startling even herself. Harrington laughed, soft and cruel. "You always did enjoy pretending," he replied. "Come back with me now, Eliza, and I might forget this embarrassment." Alaric felt the tension snap. His hand went to his sword, but Eliza raised hers, a small gesture, asking him to wait. She took another step toward Harrington. "You left me to die," she said, her voice steady. "You forfeited any claim you believed you had." His smile faded slightly. "I punished you," he said. "I did not discard you." The distinction was meaningless, and they both knew it. The meeting dissolved into threats thinly veiled as negotiation. Harrington demanded Eliza's return in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. Alaric refused without hesitation. "Then there will be war," Harrington said calmly. "There already is," Alaric replied. When Harrington's gaze flicked between them, something like understanding dawned, followed quickly by rage. "You think you can take what is mine?" he snarled. Eliza answered before Alaric could. "He didn't take me," she said. "You lost me." The words were a blade, and Harrington recoiled as if cut. He turned on his heel, signaling his men. "Enjoy what time you have," he called over his shoulder. "I will take everything from you both." As his party disappeared into the fog, the silence felt deafening. Alaric turned to Eliza, anger and admiration warring in his expression. "You put yourself in danger," he said harshly. She met his gaze, unflinching. "I ended the lie," she replied, "and I chose my side." The return journey was tense, heavy with what had been said and what could no longer be denied. That night, after the estate gates closed behind them, Eliza stood in the courtyard, looking up at the stars. Alaric joined her without a word. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the cold biting, the future uncertain. "He will come for you again," Alaric said quietly. "He will try," she replied. Then, after a breath, "And if he does, I want to stand with you, not behind you." He turned to her then, truly turning, the restraint he had clung to fraying. "This path will cost you," he said. "It already has," she answered. Their closeness was undeniable now, a force as real as the war pressing in on all sides. When his hand finally brushed hers, neither pulled away. The contact was brief, restrained, but it carried a promise heavier than any oath. They were bound now, not by chains or contracts, but by choice. The weeks that followed were relentless. Harrington's forces pushed harder, villages burned, supply lines tested. Eliza refused to be hidden away. She learned the estate's defenses, memorized escape routes, assisted where she could. Some men resented her presence, seeing only the enemy's bride. Others saw her courage and followed her lead. Alaric watched it all, pride and fear twisting together inside him. He had sworn to protect his people, and now that vow included her. One night, after a narrow victory, exhaustion stripped away the last of their defenses. In the quiet of the solar, firelight flickering, Eliza spoke what they had both been avoiding. "If this ends badly," she said, "I don't want my life to be remembered as something stolen and returned. I want it to be chosen." Alaric reached for her then, finally, cupping her face with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Whatever happens," he said, voice rough, "you are free here." When their lips met, it was not gentle nor reckless, but something forged in shared danger and hard truth. Outside, snow began to fall again, relentless and unforgiving. Inside, two people stood at the edge of something that could destroy them or save them, knowing that from this moment forward, there was no turning back. The kiss changed nothing and everything at once. When they finally pulled apart, breath unsteady, the war did not pause, the cold did not soften, and the danger did not retreat. Yet something irrevocable had shifted between them, a truth acknowledged without being spoken aloud. Eliza stepped back first, pressing her hand to her chest as if to steady her heart. Alaric turned away, jaw tight, forcing himself to remember who he was and what was required of him. Desire was a luxury neither of them could afford. Not now, not with Harrington closing in from every side like a tightening vice. The following days were a blur of preparation. Scouts returned with grim reports. Harrington was no longer testing borders. He was mobilizing fully, drawing allies with promises of land and fear. Villages that refused him were punished publicly. Refugees began to arrive at Alaric's gates, thin, terrified, carrying children wrapped in rags. Eliza helped wherever she could, organizing food, tending wounds, listening to stories she would never forget. She saw firsthand the cost of the war her existence had helped intensify, and guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many lives would be lost because Alaric had chosen mercy in a frozen forest. Alaric felt that same weight pressing down on him, though he never voiced it. In council, he was decisive, calm, unyielding. Alone, he was restless, pacing rooms worn smooth by generations of rulers who had faced their own impossible choices. He found himself watching Eliza constantly, measuring threats not just in soldiers and steel, but in glances, whispers, opportunities for betrayal. Loving her was dangerous. Protecting her was necessary. The two truths clashed until he felt torn in half by them. The first major blow came sooner than expected. Harrington's forces struck the southern grain stores under cover of night, burning months of supplies. Smoke rose against the dawn like a signal fire of despair. Alaric rode out with his men before the sun fully cleared the horizon, leaving Eliza behind the walls despite her protest. "I can help," she insisted. "I won't be another thing you lock away." He caught her shoulders, eyes fierce. "If anything happens to you while I'm gone, there will be nothing left of me that can fight," he said. The raw honesty in his voice stilled her. She nodded slowly, watching him ride away with a feeling that something vital had been torn from her chest. The battle was brutal and costly. Alaric's forces reclaimed the land, but not without loss. When he returned, bloodied and exhausted, Eliza was waiting in the courtyard. She did not rush him, did not speak. She simply stood there, relief flooding her features so openly that it hurt him to see it. That night, as the dead were counted and the wounded treated, Alaric told her the truth he had been carrying alone. "This war will not end cleanly," he said. "Harrington will burn everything before he yields." Eliza listened, then surprised him by taking his hand. "Then we make sure something survives," she said, "even if it's only the truth." Her resolve hardened into action. Eliza began speaking to the refugees, encouraging them to write accounts of Harrington's atrocities, names, places, dates. She worked with scribes to preserve these testimonies, understanding instinctively that war was not only fought with swords, but with memory. Some of Alaric's advisors objected, calling it sentimental and useless. Harrington's allies would not be swayed by stories. Eliza did not argue. She simply continued, fueled by a quiet fury born of her own suffering. Alaric watched her and realized that she was no longer merely surviving the war. She was shaping it. Harrington responded as expected. When he learned of the testimonies spreading through neutral territories, he escalated. His men captured one of Alaric's scouts and sent him back alive, bearing a message carved into his flesh. Eliza was named, claimed, promised. The sight of it nearly drove Alaric to madness. He wanted to ride out alone and end it with his own blade. Instead, he forced himself to think, to plan, to become the cold strategist Harrington feared. "He wants me to break," he said to Eliza that night. "He wants me reckless." She touched the scar on his knuckles, eyes steady. "Then don't give him what he wants." The opportunity came in the form of betrayal. One of Harrington's lesser allies, a lord grown uneasy with the mounting brutality, reached out in secret. He offered information in exchange for protection when the war ended. The information was invaluable. Routes, numbers, timing. Most importantly, it revealed Harrington's next move. He intended to take Eliza alive, publicly, to prove his dominance and humiliate Alaric beyond recovery. The ambush was planned near a mountain pass where escape would be impossible. Alaric closed his eyes when he heard it, rage and fear twisting together. Eliza stood silent, absorbing the plan meant to destroy her. "We can use this," she said finally. The room went still. "Absolutely not," Alaric snapped. "You are not bait." She met his fury without flinching. "I'm already the target," she replied. "Let me decide what that means." The argument that followed was fierce, stripped of politeness and restraint. He accused her of courting death. She accused him of denying her agency. In the end, what broke him was not logic, but the look in her eyes, the same look she must have had when she stood up to Harrington the first time and paid for it with her life nearly lost. The plan was altered, refined, layered with contingencies. Eliza would appear to travel under heavy guard, the illusion of vulnerability carefully crafted. Alaric's forces would lie in wait, the terrain turned into a weapon. Every detail was obsessed over, every risk measured. The night before it was to happen, sleep was impossible. Eliza found Alaric alone in the chapel, kneeling before an altar long and used. "I don't pray," he said quietly when he sensed her. "Neither do I," she replied. She sat beside him anyway. For a long time, they said nothing. Then Eliza spoke the fear she had been carrying. "If I don't come back," she said, voice steady only by force of will, "promise me you won't let my story be used against others." He turned to her sharply. "Don't," he said. She held his gaze. "Promise me." His throat tightened. "I promise," he said finally. "And if you don't come back, there will be no world left that Harrington can recognize." Dawn came gray and bitter. The convoy moved through the pass exactly as planned, banners visible, guards alert. Eliza sat tall in the carriage, every sense sharpened, fear humming beneath her skin. When the attack came, it was explosive. Harrington's men poured from hidden positions, confident, ruthless. The trap snapped shut moments later. Arrows darkened the sky. Steel clashed. Shouts echoed off stone. Eliza's carriage was struck, wheels shattering, throwing her hard against the interior. Dazed, bleeding, she forced herself upright as the door was torn open. Harrington himself stood there, face lit with triumph. "There you are," he said softly. "I knew you'd come home." Before she could answer, before Alaric could reach her, the mountain itself seemed to roar. An avalanche, triggered by Alaric's men, thundered down the slope, chaos swallowing strategy whole. Snow, stone, and screams merged into a single, overwhelming force. Eliza felt herself pulled, falling, everything going white. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Alaric fighting through the storm toward her, his face etched with a terror she had never seen before. When consciousness returned, it was to silence. Snow pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating. Eliza struggled to breathe, panic clawing at her throat. Then she heard it, a voice, raw and desperate, calling her name over and over again, refusing to let the world end in silence. Alaric clawed through the snow until his hands were numb and bleeding, the cold no longer something he felt, but something that existed beyond pain. He shouted her name until his voice tore raw, until every echo in the pass seemed to mock him. Men pulled at him, shouted warnings about instability, about more snow ready to fall, but he shook them off like ghosts. None of it mattered if Eliza lay buried beneath the mountain because of a plan he had allowed, because he had believed he could control chaos. When his fingers finally brushed fabric, hope slammed into him so hard it nearly stole his breath. He dug faster, heedless of the danger, until her face emerged, pale but intact, lips parted in a shallow breath. She was alive. He lifted her with shaking arms, pressing his forehead to hers for one brief, unguarded moment before barking orders to his men. The ambush had turned into a massacre for Harrington's forces, the avalanche wiping out their advantage, but Alaric barely registered the victory. Eliza was all that existed. They carried her from the pass, wrapping her against the cold, retreating before the mountain could claim more lives. Harrington's body was not found among the dead, and that knowledge lodged like a thorn in Alaric's mind. This was not over. Eliza drifted in and out of consciousness for days afterward, feverish and weak. Each time she woke, Alaric was there, seated beside her bed, armor discarded, eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something close to terror. She tried to speak, to reassure him, but her voice failed her. Instead, she squeezed his hand, and each time he responded as if that single gesture anchored him to the world. The physician spoke in cautious tones, warning of internal injuries, of the shock that still threatened her. Alaric listened, nodded, then dismissed them with curt orders to do everything possible. Titles, power, wealth, none of it meant anything if she slipped away despite it all. When she finally woke fully, the fever broken, she found him asleep in the chair beside her, head bowed, hair streaked with gray she did not remember seeing before. The sight tightened her chest. She realized then how close she had come to dying without ever telling him how deeply she had chosen him, not just as a protector, but as the man she trusted with her life and her truth. She shifted slightly, and his eyes flew open instantly, alert despite the exhaustion. When he saw her awake, truly awake, something in his expression broke. He did not speak. He simply took her hand and held it as if afraid it might vanish. "I heard you," she whispered, voice rough. "You were calling me." His grip tightened. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he said hoarsely. She almost smiled. "You're the one who taught me not to be afraid," she replied. The silence that followed was heavy, but no longer uncertain. Whatever lines they had tried to maintain were gone, buried beneath snow and blood and the knowledge of how easily they could have lost each other. News spread quickly. Harrington's ambush had failed spectacularly. Many of his allies abandoned him outright, unwilling to be crushed beneath the same mountain. Testimonies Eliza had gathered began circulating more widely now, carried by merchants and envoys who had witnessed the aftermath of the pass. Stories of the abandoned bride, the attempted capture, the avalanche that turned predator into prey. These things took on a life of their own. Harrington's name became synonymous with cruelty unchecked, ambition turned monstrous. Still, he remained at large, wounded but dangerous, a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. Eliza recovered slowly, frustration gnawing at her as her body lagged behind her will. She hated being confined to bed, hated the helplessness creeping back in her bones. Alaric tried to hide his relief at her forced rest, but she saw it anyway. "I won't stay broken," she told him one evening when he suggested more time. "I know," he replied quietly. "That's what frightens me." She reached for him then, resting her forehead against his chest. "I don't want you to protect me from the world," she said. "I want you to stand in it with me." His arms wrapped around her without hesitation. "Then we will stand together," he said, "until this ends." The end came closer than either of them expected. Harrington, driven by desperation and fury, made his final move not with an army, but with a knife in the dark. One night, under cover of a festival meant to lift spirits after months of war, he slipped into the estate disguised among traders and performers. Eliza sensed something wrong before the alarm sounded, a familiar chill crawling up her spine. She turned just in time to see him emerge from the crowd, eyes burning, blade flashing in torchlight. He seized her arm, dragging her back, his grip bruising. "You always did survive when you shouldn't," he hissed. "I won't make that mistake again." Alaric moved without thought, crashing through the crowd as guards shouted. The world narrowed to the space between him and Harrington, between Eliza's terrified but defiant gaze and the blade poised at her throat. "Let her go," Alaric commanded, voice deadly calm. Harrington laughed, wild and broken. "You think this ends with borders and titles?" he snarled. "End with me taking back what is mine." Eliza's fear vanished, replaced by a cold clarity. "You never owned me," she said. "You only taught me what I would never accept again." In the chaos, Eliza acted. She stomped hard on Harrington's foot, twisting out of his grip just enough for the blade to nick her shoulder instead of her throat. Alaric was on him instantly. Steel rang as they clashed, the fight brutal and personal, years of hatred condensed in a violent motion. Harrington fought like a man already dead, reckless and savage. Alaric fought like a man with something to protect. The difference was decisive. When Harrington fell, disarmed and bleeding, the crowd fell silent, the moment suspended. Alaric stood over him, sword raised. Harrington spat blood and laughed weakly. "Do it," he said. "Become what you pretend not to be." Alaric hesitated, not out of mercy for Harrington, but because he felt Eliza's gaze on him, steady and trusting. He lowered the blade. "No," he said, "I won't give you that." He turned to the guards. "Take him. He will stand trial before every territory he's wronged." Harrington screamed as he was dragged away, the sound fading into nothing. The trial that followed was swift but thorough. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by Eliza's survival and the public nature of Harrington's defeat. His crimes were laid bare, impossible to deny or excuse. When judgment was passed, it was not death but lifelong imprisonment, stripped of power, stripped of the audience he craved. Oblivion was the punishment he feared most. With Harrington removed, the war unraveled quickly. Alliances dissolved, borders stabilized. The North finally granted a fragile peace. In the quiet that followed, Eliza found herself standing at the edge of a life she had never imagined. She was no longer a bride, no longer a pawn, no longer a symbol of conflict. She was herself, shaped by pain, but not defined by it. Alaric stood beside her as the first true spring in years touched the land, green breaking through white. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Alaric took her to the forest where they had first met. The snow long melted, the ground soft beneath their feet. "This is where everything changed," he said. Eliza nodded. "This is where I survived," she replied. He took her hands, no longer armored, no longer guarded. "Stay," he said simply. It was not a command, not a bargain. It was an invitation. Eliza looked at him, at the man who had chosen mercy when hatred would have been easier, who had stood with her when the world tried to break her. "I'm not staying because you saved me," she said. "I'm staying because I choose you." His breath caught, and for the first time since she had known him, the Black Duke smiled without restraint. The forest was quiet, alive with promise. And those scars remained, both seen and unseen. They stood together knowing that the story that began with abandonment in the snow had ended not with possession or victory, but with choice, freedom, and a future forged by two people who refused to let cruelty have the final word. Peace did not arrive with trumpets or celebration. It seeped into the land cautiously, like sunlight after a long storm, fragile and uncertain. Eliza learned quickly that survival was not the same as healing. With Harrington imprisoned and the war officially ended, the estate grew quieter, but silence carried its own weight. There were no alarms now, no urgent counsels, no cries in the night, yet memories filled the empty spaces, pressing in when no one was looking. Eliza felt it in the way her body tensed at sudden movements, in the instinct to catalog exits whenever she entered a room. Freedom, she discovered, required learning how to live without fear dictating every breath. Alaric faced his own reckoning. The Black Duke had been shaped by war, defined by resistance and loss. Without an enemy at his gates, he felt unmoored, as if the world had shifted beneath his feet and he had not yet found his balance. He spent long hours riding the borders, inspecting villages, listening to grievances that had been buried beneath years of conflict. His people looked at him differently now, not just as a war leader, but as a ruler who had chosen restraint when vengeance was within reach. That respect humbled him more than victory ever had. Eliza began to carve out a place for herself that did not rely on Alaric's shadow. She refused the title of consort, refused even the suggestion of it. "Not yet," she said when the advisors carefully raised the matter. "I need to know who I am without belonging to anyone." Alaric supported her publicly, silencing dissent with a single look. Privately, he wrestled with the fear that she might one day decide her path led away from him. He said nothing of it, knowing that love demanded freedom, not ownership. She spent her days traveling to the villages most damaged by Harrington's campaigns, listening to stories, offering aid, helping rebuild where she could. People recognized her, whispered her name with a mixture of awe and sympathy. The abandoned bride, the woman who defied a lord and lived. Eliza corrected them gently. I didn't survive because I was brave, she told a group of women once. I survived because someone chose not to let cruelty decide my ending. And then, softer, you can choose that too. The words spread faster than she expected. Not everyone welcomed her presence. Some men saw her as a reminder of shame, of battles lost and choices questioned. One evening, as Eliza returned from a journey, a stone shattered against the wall near her head, thrown from the shadows. The message was clear enough. Alaric's fury was immediate, dangerous. He wanted guards doubled, escorts increased, threats crushed before they could grow. Eliza stopped him with a hand on his arm. If you answer fear with force now, she said, it will never end. He looked at her, struggling, then nodded once. Instead of punishment, he ordered open forums, letting grievances be aired rather than buried. The tension eased, slowly, painfully, but it eased. Their relationship existed in a strange, careful balance. They shared meals, shared silence, shared nights that were intimate without always being physical. Sometimes they lay together, fully clothed, simply breathing, relearning what safety felt like in another person's presence. Other nights, Eliza slept alone, needing space to hear her own thoughts. Alaric never questioned it. Trust, he understood now, was built in moments like these, not demanded, not enforced. The past, however, refused to stay buried. Harrington's supporters, though scattered, were not gone. Whispers reached Alaric of an attempt to free him, of plots forming in places where old loyalties ran deep. Eliza heard them too, and felt the familiar chill settle in her bones. One night, she sought Alaric out on the battlements, where he stood watching the horizon. If they succeed, she said quietly, it will start again. Alaric nodded. Which is why it must end properly, he replied. He had already made his decision. The trial had been thorough, but its consequences had not reached far enough. Alaric proposed something unprecedented, a gathering of regional rulers, witnesses, and common people alike, where Harrington's crimes would be read aloud, recorded, and acknowledged publicly. Not just punishment, but truth laid bare. Many advisors objected, calling it dangerous, inflammatory. Eliza supported him without hesitation. Silence is what allowed him to thrive, she said. Light is the only thing that will stop men like him from rising again. The gathering took place in the Capitol Square, under an open sky. Harrington was brought out in chains, thinner now, his arrogance stripped, but his eyes still burning with hatred. Eliza stood among the crowd, not elevated, not hidden. When her testimony was read, the moment he had left her in the snow, the murmurs turned into gasps, then into anger. Harrington shouted denials, insults, curses, but his voice was drowned out by the weight of accumulated truth. Victims spoke. Soldiers spoke. Villagers spoke. The narrative he had controlled for years shattered beyond repair. When it was over, Harrington was returned to his cell, no longer feared, no longer powerful, reduced to a footnote in a story he no longer owned. The threat of rescue faded with him, his supporters unwilling to die for a man the world now saw clearly. The final cord binding Eliza to her past snapped quietly, without ceremony. Afterward, exhaustion claimed her. The release was overwhelming, like stepping out of a storm she had lived in for so long she had forgotten what clear air felt like. She retreated inward for days, speaking little, sleeping often. Alaric stayed close, but did not intrude, guarding her space as fiercely as he once guarded her body. When she finally emerged, she seemed lighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted from her shoulders. I think I'm ready now, she said one evening as they walked through the gardens, new growth pushing through earth still scarred by frost. Alaric's heart stuttered. Ready for what? He asked carefully. She stopped, turned to face him fully. To choose a future, she said. Not one shaped by fear, or revenge, or survival. One shaped by intention. He waited, knowing better than to rush her. Eliza took a steadying breath. I want to stay, she said. Not because I need protection. Not because I owe you my life. I want to build something here. With you. The relief that washed over him was so intense it left him dizzy. Then stay, he said softly, and build it with me. Their decision did not end all doubt or struggle. It marked the beginning of a different kind of work, slower, harder in ways Warren never was. Together, they drafted reforms, restructured land rights, ensured protections for women who had once been traded like currency. Eliza insisted on it, her voice unwavering. If my story is to mean anything, she said, it must change more than just my own ending. Alaric backed her fully, weathering backlash with the same calm resolve he had once reserved for battlefields. Love grew between them in the quiet moments, and shared purpose in the simple act of choosing each other every day without fear or coercion. It was not a fairy tale, not untouched by scars, but it was real, and that made it stronger. When Alaric finally asked her to stand beside him formally, not as property or prize, but as equal, Eliza accepted with a smile that held no hesitation. The woman who had once been left to die in the snow now stood at the center of a changing world, not because she had been saved, but because she had survived, spoken, and chosen. And the Duke who had once been defined by darkness learned, slowly, that mercy was not a weakness, but the foundation upon which a better future could be built. The formal announcement of their partnership did not bring instant harmony. It stirred the realm like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of hope and resistance in equal measure. Some hailed Eliza as a symbol of renewal, proof that the North had chosen justice over brute force. Others whispered that she was a dangerous influence, a reminder of humiliation they would rather forget. Eliza felt the weight of every gaze when she stood beside Alaric in council, her posture straight, her voice calm. She had learned that confidence was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be ruled by it. The first true test came when neighboring lords demanded assurances. They questioned Eliza's role, her authority, her intentions. Alaric allowed her to answer for herself. She spoke plainly, without ornament or apology. She spoke of accountability, of systems that protected the vulnerable, of a future where power was measured not by how much fear it inspired, but by how much stability it created. Some listened, some did not, but none could deny the clarity of her resolve. Behind closed doors, the strain took its toll. Eliza struggled with exhaustion, the kind that sleep could not cure. Nightmares returned, less frequent but sharper, dragging her back to snow and darkness and the certainty of being forgotten. Alaric learned to wake at the slightest change in her breathing, to ground her without words, his presence a quiet anchor. In those moments, titles meant nothing. They were simply two people holding each other against the past. As reforms began to take shape, resistance hardened. A coalition of minor nobles, emboldened by old loyalties, refused to implement new protections. They delayed, deflected, quietly undermined. Eliza recognized the pattern immediately. Harrington had ruled through the same tactics. She urged patience, strategy, documentation. Force will only prove them right, she told Alaric. Let them expose themselves. He listened, though it went against every instinct honed by war. The exposure came sooner than expected. Evidence surfaced of forced labor, of seized lands justified by fabricated debts, of women punished for speaking out. Eliza insisted the findings be made public. The backlash was swift and vicious. Anonymous threats arrived. Symbols were carved into doors in the night. One message, written in a hand she recognized from Harrington's court, warned her to remember what happened the last time she defied a lord. Her hand shook as she read it, anger burning hotter than fear. They think silence will protect them, she said. It never does. Alaric increased security, but Eliza refused to retreat from public life. She continued visiting villages, meeting councils, standing in open squares to listen. The more visible she became, the harder it was for her enemies to act without consequence. Support grew where resistance had been loudest. People who had never been asked for their stories found their voices, and once found, they did not surrender them easily. A year passed, marked not by a single decisive moment, but by hundreds of small ones. Laws were rewritten. Courts were restructured. The process was slow, imperfect, and exhausting. Eliza learned to accept compromise without surrendering principle, to recognize progress, even when it came in inches rather than strides. Alaric learned to lead without an enemy to fight, to measure success by what endured rather than what fell. Their relationship deepened in parallel, steady and unforced. They argued, sometimes fiercely, about priorities and risks and the cost of pushing too fast. They apologized. They adjusted. Love, Eliza realized, was not the dramatic defiance she had once imagined, but the daily choice to remain present even when it was uncomfortable. Alaric discovered that strength did not diminish when shared. It multiplied. The past returned one final time in an unexpected form. A letter arrived bearing a familiar seal, not Harrington's, but that of his eldest cousin, a man who had kept his distance during the war. The letter contained an apology, measured and sincere, and an offer to testify against remaining loyalists in exchange for reconciliation. Eliza read it twice, weighing the risk. "People can change," she said finally, "but trust should be earned." Alaric agreed. They accepted the testimony, not the absolution. The testimony dismantled the last remnants of the old network. With it, the threats faded into memory. The realm settled into a cautious peace that felt earned rather than imposed. When the Harvest Festival arrived that autumn, it was celebrated openly for the first time in years. Eliza walked among the stalls without escort, laughter rising around her, the air thick with the scent of bread and apples. She paused to watch children chase one another between lanterns, their joy uncomplicated. For a moment, she let herself believe in an unburdened future. That night, Alaric took her hand and led her back to the forest edge, where the first frost glittered under a clear sky. He did not kneel. He did not make a spectacle. He simply asked her, quietly, whether she would continue to choose this life, this work, this love, with him. Eliza answered without hesitation. The promise they exchanged was not ownership or rescue, but partnership bound by consent and purpose. As winter approached again, it no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply a season, one they would endure together. Eliza stood at the window of the keep, watching the first snow fall, remembering another night, another ending that had almost been. She placed a hand over her heart, steady and strong. The story that began with abandonment had not ended with revenge or romance alone, but with transformation. And as the snow softened the world outside, she knew, with a certainty born of survival and choice, that this was only the beginning. Winter returned with a gentler hand than before, yet it carried reminders Eliza could not ignore. The snow no longer felt like a threat, but it still whispered of what had almost been lost. She learned to move through those memories without letting them pull her under, though some days required more effort than others. The people noticed the change in her, the way she listened more than she spoke now, the way her strength had settled into something quiet and unshakable. She was no longer a symbol they projected upon. She was present, human, imperfect, and that made her influence stronger than any legend. Alaric found his own transformation unsettling at times. He had ruled for years by anticipating violence, by preparing for the worst in every interaction. Now, he was required to imagine futures instead of endings. He worked alongside Eliza to establish councils that included voices long ignored, farmers and traders, and women who had once been barred from such spaces entirely. The debates were fierce, messy, and often frustrating. Progress demanded patience, a skill Alaric was still learning. Eliza's calm persistence became his anchor, reminding him that enduring change rarely arrived through force. Their shared days settled into a rhythm shaped by purpose. Mornings brought reports and meetings. Afternoons were spent traveling or drafting reforms. Evenings, when they could steal them, were quieter. Sometimes they spoke of nothing important at all, finding comfort in ordinary moments they had once believed impossible. Other nights, they sat together in silence, hands entwined, letting the absence of crisis feel real enough to trust. Not everyone welcomed this new order. In the far eastern territories, unrest simmered. Old loyalties ran deep there, bound by tradition and resentment. Rumors reached the capital of gatherings held in secret, of men invoking Harrington's name as a rallying cry. Eliza recognized the danger immediately. "They're clinging to the idea of him," she said. "Not the man, but what he represented to them." Alaric nodded grimly. Symbols were powerful, especially when fear gave them shape. Instead of sending soldiers, they sent envoys. Eliza insisted on going herself, despite the risks. "If they only see armor, they'll believe force is the only language we speak," she said. Alaric argued, then relented, assigning a small escort he trusted with his life. The journey east was tense, the air thick with suspicion. Villages watched them pass with guarded eyes, doors closing softly in their wake. The meeting took place in a longhouse worn smooth by time. The men who gathered there expected confrontation. What they received was something far more disarming. Eliza spoke of responsibility, not blame. She acknowledged fear without validating cruelty. She spoke of Harrington's fall not as a victory over enemies, but as a warning of what unchecked power became. When accusations were hurled at her, she did not deflect them. She listened. Slowly, resistance softened into reluctant engagement. By the time they left, no oaths had been sworn, but something fragile had shifted. The cost of leadership showed itself afterward. Eliza fell ill during the return journey, exhaustion finally claiming its due. Fever pinned her to the bed for days, her strength sapped by months of relentless effort. Alaric refused to leave her side, old fear resurfacing with brutal force. He watched her breathe, counted every rise and fall of her chest, haunted by the memory of snow pressing in around her. When she recovered, slowly and stubbornly, she found him quieter, more protective than before. "You don't have to carry this alone," she told him gently. He looked at her as if the thought were both terrifying and necessary. "I know," he said. "I'm still learning how." As spring crept closer, signs of lasting peace began to appear. Trade routes reopened. Borders stabilized. Children born during the war grew without knowing the sound of marching armies. Eliza visited a school established in one of the rebuilt villages, watching as girls and boys learned side by side. The sight filled her with a fierce, aching hope. She realized then that legacy was not carved in stone or sealed with blood. It was taught quietly day after day. Alaric proposed a formal union as spring broke fully across the land, not in a grand hall, but in the council chamber where so much hard truth had been spoken. He did not frame it as destiny or reward. He framed it as partnership, shared burden, shared authority. Eliza accepted with the same calm certainty that had guided her through every choice since the night she had refused to die in the snow. The announcement was met with mixed reactions, but none could deny that it reflected the reality they had already built together. Preparations were simple by design. No extravagant display, no pageantry meant to impress. Eliza insisted the gathering include common people as well as nobility, witnesses to a union that represented more than personal happiness. On the morning of the ceremony, she stood alone briefly, breathing in the moment. She thought of the forest, the cold, the silence she had survived. She thought of the woman she had been, shaped by obedience and fear. She felt no sorrow for that version of herself, only gratitude for having outgrown it. When she joined Alaric, standing beneath an open sky, there was no doubt left in either of them. The vows they exchanged were plain, unadorned, spoken with the weight of truth rather than spectacle. They promised honesty, restraint, courage, and the freedom to remain themselves even as they stood together. The crowd did not cheer wildly. They listened, and in that listening, something deeper than celebration took root. That night, as lanterns glowed softly and music drifted through the air, Eliza stepped away briefly to the edge of the gathering. She watched the people she had once feared, now laughing, now alive. Alaric joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No," she said. "I finally understand what survival was preparing me for." The stars burned bright above them, steady and indifferent to human struggle. Eliza felt a profound peace settle in her chest, not because life would now be easy, but because it would be chosen again and again. The story that had begun with abandonment had become something else entirely, shaped not by the cruelty of one man, but by the resilience of many. And as the night deepened, she knew with certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would be faced not in fear, but with purpose. The marriage did not mark an ending so much as a threshold. Eliza felt it immediately in the days that followed. The subtle shift in how people addressed her, the expectations layered onto every gesture. She was no longer merely a survivor or a reformer or partner. She was now a figure the realm watched closely, waiting to see what shape she would take. Eliza refused to be hardened by it. She had learned that rigidity was another form of fear, and fear was something she would no longer allow to guide her life. With spring fully settled, attention turned from rebuilding to reckoning. The war had ended, but its consequences lingered in ledgers, in land disputes, in families fractured by loss. Alaric convened assemblies across the north, and Eliza insisted on attending each one. She listened as widows spoke of seized fields, as soldiers questioned promises made and forgotten, as merchants argued over routes and tariffs that had once been lifelines. There were days when the weight of it all pressed so hard she could barely breathe, when the sheer scale of suffering felt insurmountable. On those days, Alaric would find her later, silent and distant, and remind her gently that no single person could mend everything. "But someone has to begin," she would reply, and return to the work. Opposition grew more organized as reforms advanced. Not violent, not yet, but cunning. Letters circulated questioning Eliza's influence, implying she ruled through emotion rather than reason. Old power structures bristled at transparency, at records opened and testimonies preserved. One pamphlet, distributed anonymously, painted her as a manipulator who had ensnared the Duke for her own ambition. Eliza read it without expression, then placed it carefully on the table. "This is what fear sounds like when it learns new words," she said. Alaric wanted to crush the authors publicly. She stopped him. "If we silence them," she said, "we become what they accuse us of." Instead, she answered with action, inviting scrutiny, opening meetings, allowing questions that cut deep. The pamphlets lost their power when confronted by daylight. Yet the strain showed. Eliza's health faltered again, not dramatically, but persistently. Fatigue lingered, headaches bloomed without warning, her body reminding her that survival had come at a cost. Physicians urged rest. She resisted until Alaric finally confronted her, not as a ruler, but as the man who had nearly lost her beneath a mountain of snow. "You don't have to prove your worth by breaking yourself," he said quietly. The words struck deeper than any rebuke. Eliza listened. For the first time, she allowed herself to step back, delegating more, trusting others to carry parts of the burden. It was harder than facing an enemy. It required faith. That faith was tested when unrest flared in the western borderlands. Not rebellion, but desperation. A poor harvest and lingering resentment ignited clashes between neighboring communities. Alaric prepared troops as a precaution. Eliza proposed something different. She requested permission to go herself, unarmed, accompanied only by mediators and supplies. Alaric argued fiercely, fear blazing beneath his control. "If anything happens to you," she placed a hand over his, steady and warm. "If we answer every conflict with soldiers," she said, "we teach people that force is the only language worth speaking." He relented, though the decision cost him sleep. The journey west was tense, but transformative. Eliza met farmers whose land had been divided unfairly decades earlier, traders whose livelihoods depended on access denied them by old decrees. She listened until voices softened, until anger found words instead of fists. Agreements were tentative, imperfect, but they held. When she returned, weary but unhurt, Alaric embraced her without reservation, relief shuddering through him. "You were right," he admitted. She smiled faintly. Sometimes peace just needs to be witnessed. Summer arrived heavy and bright, bringing with it the first true sense of normalcy the realm had known in years. Markets thrived, roads bustled, children played without glancing over their shoulders. Eliza found joy in these small confirmations that their work mattered. She also found herself confronting a quieter challenge: who she was when she was not needed every moment. Purpose had once been survival, then reform, then resistance. Now, there were hours without urgency. The emptiness unsettled her more than chaos ever had. It was Alaric who noticed first. "You don't rest," he said one evening as they walked along the riverbank. "You hover." She considered that, watching water slide over stone. "I'm afraid that if I stop," she admitted, "everything I was before will catch up to me." He took her hand. "It already has," he said gently, "and you're still here." The simplicity of it steadied her. Healing, she realized, was not an event. It was a practice. The realm's first true crisis of peace came unexpectedly. A drought in the south threatened trade and stability, drawing pressure from neighboring territories. Where war would once have followed, Eliza proposed cooperation. She traveled with envoys to negotiate shared resources, joint planning, mutual accountability. Skepticism was fierce. Trust was thin, but necessity forced honesty. Agreements were reached, fragile but real. When rain finally came, it felt like vindication not of strategy, but of restraint. As autumn approached, whispers of a new threat surfaced. Not a man or an army, but an idea. Some factions began to romanticize the war, casting it as a time of clarity and strength, glossing over its brutality. Eliza recognized the danger immediately. "If we allow suffering to be rewritten as glory," she warned, "we plant the seeds for the next conflict." Together, she and Alaric commissioned histories that included testimony alongside triumph, pain alongside policy. Schools taught complexity, not legend. It was slower, less stirring than songs of conquest, but it endured. Their marriage evolved quietly, shaped by mutual respect and hard-earned trust. They disagreed often, sometimes sharply, but never with cruelty. They learned each other's silences, the moments when words would wound rather than heal. Love, Eliza discovered, was not a shield against hardship. It was a place to return when hardship had done its worst. Late one evening, as the first frost hinted at winter's return, Eliza stood again at the forest edge where her story had begun. The trees were bare now, honest in their emptiness. Alaric joined her, wrapping a cloak around her shoulders. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. She nodded. "Not with fear," she said, "with gratitude." He studied her, the woman who had walked out of death and reshaped a realm. "I sometimes wonder who I would be," he admitted, "if I hadn't stopped." Eliza smiled softly. "We'll never know," she said, "but I like who you chose to become." As winter threatened once more, it did not feel like a test. It felt like a season to be met, together, with preparation rather than dread. Eliza turned toward the keep, toward warmth and work and the quiet, ongoing labor of peace. The story that had once been driven by survival was now guided by intention, and though the future remained uncertain, it no longer felt unwritten. It felt earned.